Good evening, and welcome to Cafe Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. Tonight, we join the methodical superintendent Battle in the grim industrial town of Halverton. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. If you enjoy these stories, a quick like really helps keep Cafe Stories alive. Now settle in with a steaming cup of tea, and let's uncover the truth behind a murder that some believed didn't matter. Murder doesn't matter. Chapter 1. The Letter. The Morning Post arrived at Scotland Yard with its usual punctuality, deposited by a constable who moved with the measured tread of a man who had performed the same duty for 15 years, without variation. Superintendent Battle glanced up from his methodical examination of overnight reports, noting with the automatic precision that marked all his observations that the constable's left boot heel was wearing unevenly. A small matter, but one that spoke to habits of posture and gait that might prove significant in other circumstances. February had settled over London with characteristic grimness, the sky pressed low and grey against the building's windows. Battle's office, though small and sparsely furnished, maintained an atmosphere of quiet efficiency. His desk held no personal photographs or decorative items, only the tools of his profession arranged with careful precision. A fountain pen, a magnifying glass of modest size, and a small notebook bound in worn leather. The morning's correspondence proved largely routine. 3 interdepartmental memoranda regarding staffing schedules, a formal complaint about police conduct in Whitechapel that would require delicate handling, and a report from Manchester concerning a series of warehouse burglaries. Battle read each document with the same measured attention, making occasional notes in his careful handwriting. The 5th envelope differed from the others in several immediately apparent ways. The paper was of inferior quality, cream-coloured but rough to the touch, suggesting purchase from a village stationer rather than a professional establishment. The address, written in blue ink from what appeared to be a fountain pen of good quality, showed signs of careful formation, as though the writer had laboured over each letter. Most curious of all, the postmark bore the name of a place Battle had never heard mentioned in professional circles, Halverton, Staffordshire. Inside he found not the usual official communication or citizen's complaint, but something altogether more intriguing. The letter itself occupied a single sheet of the same rough paper, filled with text in the same careful handwriting. Battle read it twice before setting it aside to examine the other contents of the envelope. A small piece of cloth, approximately 2 inches square, had been wrapped in tissue paper. The fabric appeared to be wool, dark blue in colour, with what looked unmistakably like dried bloodstains along one edge. Beneath the tissue lay a folded sheet of paper containing a crude but detailed sketch. The drawing showed what appeared to be the grounds of a substantial estate, a large house, outbuildings, and what might have been industrial structures, all connected by carefully drawn pathways and marked with various notations in the same blue ink. Battle returned to the letter itself, holding it near the window to catch what pale light filtered through the February gloom. The text was brief but specific. "Sir, a man has been killed in our village and the wrong person blamed. Elijah Grant was murdered behind Halverton Mill 3 days past. The police say it was a drunken fight with Thomas Dawes, but this is false. Grant was killed by someone above the factory floor, someone who thinks murder doesn't matter when it concerns people like us. The cloth was found near the canal bridge. I cannot sign my name for fear, but justice must be served. The handwriting suggested education, yet the paper and circumstances implied modest means. Battle noted the careful grammar and vocabulary choices, which contrasted sharply with the crude sketch and the obvious fear that prevented signature. Most interesting was the phrase, "someone above the factory floor," which suggested intimate knowledge of local social hierarchies. He opened his notebook and began recording details with characteristic thoroughness. The postmark date indicated the letter had been sent 2 days after the alleged crime occurred. The bloodstains on the cloth appeared genuine, though laboratory analysis would be required for confirmation. The sketch, while crude, showed sufficient detail to suggest the artist had intimate knowledge of the location depicted. Battle had encountered numerous anonymous accusations during his career, most proving to be the products of personal vendettas or neighborhood disputes. Yet something about this particular communication suggested genuine distress rather than malicious mischief. The careful preparation, the sketch, the physical evidence, the restrained but specific language indicated someone who understood the requirements of serious accusation while lacking the confidence to make formal complaint. He reached for his railway timetable, a thick volume that lived in his desk's bottom drawer. Halverton appeared to be a small industrial town approximately 2 hours north of London by train. The surrounding area was described as mining and textile country, the sort of place where factories provided employment for several generations of the same families. The decision formed itself with the quiet certainty that characterized most of Battle's professional choices. Whatever had occurred in Halverton might well prove to be exactly what local authorities claimed, a regrettable but straightforward case of violence among working men. Yet the anonymous correspondent's obvious fear, combined with the careful preparation of evidence, suggested complexities that merited investigation. Battle folded the letter carefully and placed it, along with the cloth sample and sketch, in a manila envelope which he labeled with location, date, and case reference number. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, reflecting the methodical approach that had served him well throughout 23 years of police work. Chapter 2. The Mill Town. The train to Halverton departed London precisely at 9:47, carrying Battle through countryside that grew increasingly industrial as the morning progressed. He observed the gradual transformation from suburban sprawl to agricultural land, then to the smoking chimneys and terraced housing that marked England's manufacturing heartland. The compartment he occupied was nearly empty, shared only with a commercial traveller who spent the journey organising samples of buttons and thread in a battered leather case. Halverton announced itself long before the train reached the station. Dark smoke rose from multiple chimneys, creating a perpetual grey haze that seemed to settle over the surrounding hills like a threadbare blanket. The mill dominated the town's eastern edge, its brick buildings sprawling along the banks of what appeared to be a small river or canal. Even from the railway carriage, Battle could hear the rhythmic clatter of machinery that never seemed to cease. The station platform was nearly deserted at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning. A porter with greying whiskers and clothes that spoke of long service directed Battle toward the town centre with the careful politeness reserved for visitors whose business remained uncertain. The walk provided an excellent opportunity to survey the community's geography and social organisation. Halverton's layout revealed the typical pattern of industrial towns. The mill and its associated buildings dominated the eastern section, while rows of workers' cottages stretched westward in neat, identical lines. Beyond these, on slightly elevated ground, stood larger houses with small gardens and better maintenance. At the town's western edge, partially concealed by mature trees, Battle glimpsed what appeared to be a substantial estate house. The police station occupied a modest brick building on High Street, wedged between a bakery and a shop advertising household goods. Inspector Briggs proved to be a man of middle years with the solid build and direct manner common to provincial police officers. His greeting was cordial but cautious, reflecting uncertainty about Battle's reasons for travelling from London. "Superintendent Battle, is it?" Briggs settled behind his desk with the air of a man preparing for unwelcome complications. "Can't say we often receive visits from Scotland Yard. What brings you to our little corner of Staffordshire?" "A routine inquiry," Battle replied, maintaining the deliberately vague tone that served him well in such circumstances. "I understand you recently had a death here, a factory worker named Grant." Briggs's expression cleared somewhat, though watchfulness remained in his eyes. "Ah, yes, unfortunate business that. Elijah Grant found dead behind the mill 4 days ago, head bashed in with a piece of iron piping. We've got the man who did it, though, young Thomas Dawes. Works at the mill same as Grant did." "What makes you certain of Dawes's guilt?" "Well now," Briggs leaned back in his chair, "it's straightforward enough. Grant and Dawes had been at odds for weeks, according to witnesses. Some disagreement about work conditions, though between you and me, these people are always complaining about something. The night Grant died, several folks saw them arguing outside the Lamb and Flag. Both had been drinking, tempers ran high, and things went too far." Battle made no comment, allowing his silence to encourage elaboration. "Found the weapon near the body," Briggs continued. "A length of pipe from the mill's maintenance stores. Grant's blood on it, clear as day. Dawes can't account for his whereabouts after leaving the pub, claims he went straight home, but his mother was already asleep. No one to verify his story." "Have you spoken with the Dawes family?" "Course we have. The boy's mother swears he came home and went straight to bed. But what would you expect her to say? Father's dead these 5 years. Poor woman's trying to protect her son. Natural enough, but it doesn't change the facts." Battle absorbed this information without visible reaction. "What of the mill owners? Have they cooperated with your investigation?" "Oh yes, completely helpful they've been. Mr. Cyril Halverton came down to the station personally, offered any assistance we might need. Proper gentleman he is, quite concerned about the effect on worker morale, naturally enough. Can't have violence disrupting business." "And his son?" Briggs looked momentarily puzzled. "Vincent Halverton? What about him?" "I merely wondered if he had any knowledge of the incident." "Well, he wasn't even in town that night. Gone to London on business, according to his father. Besides, young Vincent wouldn't have cause to involve himself with mill workers. Different social circles entirely, if you take my meaning." Battle took his meaning quite clearly, though he offered no indication of agreement or disagreement. Instead, he requested permission to examine the crime scene, a request Briggs granted with the slightly patronizing air of a man humoring a superior's unnecessary thoroughness. The walk to Halverton Mill took 15 minutes along streets that grew progressively more industrial. Workers' cottages gave way to warehouses and supply yards, while the sound of machinery grew steadily louder. The mill itself proved impressive in its size and obvious prosperity, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways and a tall chimney that sent dark smoke into the grey sky. The crime scene lay behind the main building, near a loading dock that faced the canal. Battle examined the area with characteristic patience, noting details that Briggs had either missed or considered unimportant. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance, though whether from the struggle or subsequent investigation remained unclear. More interesting was the precise location where Grant's body had been discovered, not in the open area where a drunken fight might naturally conclude, but tucked behind a stack of empty crates where discovery would be delayed. The supposed murder weapon had been removed, but Battle studied the spot where it was found with careful attention. Something about the scene suggested arrangement rather than abandonment, though he kept this observation to himself. As they returned to the station, Battle maintained the casual conversation that often yielded unexpected information. The picture that emerged was of a community where social boundaries remained clearly defined, where the mill owner's benevolence was praised but not questioned, and where convenient explanations were readily accepted. Chapter 3. The Halvertons. The estate gates of Halverton House stood open in a manner that suggested confidence rather than carelessness. Battle approached on foot, having declined Inspector Briggs's offer of transportation, with the explanation that he preferred to observe the landscape at walking pace. The gravelled drive curved through mature parkland where sheep grazed between oak trees that predated the industrial transformation of the surrounding countryside. The house itself commanded attention through size rather than architectural distinction. Built of local stone in the Georgian manner, it possessed the solid prosperity of successful commerce rather than ancient lineage. Battle noted the recent additions, a motor house, telephone wires, and the general appearance of a property maintained by reliable income rather than inherited wealth. A manservant answered the door with the practiced deference of domestic service, though his accent suggested local origins rather than metropolitan training. He conducted Battle through a hall decorated with paintings that celebrated industrial progress, scenes of mills, railways, and commercial shipping that spoke to the source of Halverton prosperity. Cyril Halverton received his visitor in a study that served as monument to charitable endeavour. Photographs covered one wall showing the mill owner presenting donations to various worthy causes, a new wing for the local hospital, uniforms for the church choir, prizes at the annual agricultural show. The man himself proved to be in his middle 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to deference and the complexion that spoke of regular meals and indoor work. Superintendent Battle, I presume? Halverton rose from behind a mahogany desk that could have accommodated a small dinner party. Inspector Briggs mentioned you might call. Most unusual to have Scotland Yard take interest in our local difficulties. A routine matter, Mr. Halverton, Battle replied, accepting the offered chair with the same deliberate courtesy he had shown Inspector Briggs. I understand you've been most cooperative with the local investigation. Naturally. Most shocking business, this killing. Poor Grant, whatever his faults, didn't deserve such an end. Halverton's tone carried the measured regret of a man discussing an unfortunate but distant occurrence. Though I confess I wasn't entirely surprised. These people, well, they have different ways of settling disputes. Battle made no comment on this observation, instead asking, "You knew Grant personally?" As much as one knows any particular worker among 300. He'd been with the mill some years, competent enough at his duties when he applied himself. Lately, though, he'd become rather difficult, always stirring up the others with complaints about this and that. Dangerous working conditions, unfair treatment, the usual grievances. Were his complaints justified? Halverton's expression took on the patient air of a man explaining obvious truths to the uninformed. Superintendent, I've spent 20 years building this mill into one of the most progressive operations in the Midlands. Our safety record exceeds government standards, our wages match or exceed regional averages, and our workers enjoy benefits unknown in most establishments. If Grant found cause for complaint, it spoke more to his character than our conditions. What manner of complaints did he make? Oh, the usual nonsense. Claimed certain workers received preferential treatment based on matters that have no bearing on industrial efficiency. Grant had ideas about social equality that belonged more to political meetings than factory floors. Disruptive ideas, you understand, particularly among the foreign elements we employ. Battle's expression remained neutral, though he noted the careful phrasing. Foreign elements? We employ several families who came here during the war years seeking honest work. Jamaicans mostly, though a few from other colonies. Hard-working people when properly supervised, but they sometimes require firmer guidance than our local workers. Grant appointed himself their spokesman, as it were, which created unnecessary tensions. The study door opened to admit a younger man whose entrance commanded immediate attention. Vincent Halverton possessed the confident bearing and cultivated appearance that spoke of expensive education and social advantages. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his manner that of someone accustomed to making favourable impressions. "Father, I didn't realize we had a visitor from London." Vincent's voice carried the slight modification of accent that suggested university training overlaying regional origins. "Superintendent Battle is investigating the grant business," Cyril Halverton explained. "Vincent, my son and heir to all this responsibility." "Terrible affair," Vincent said, settling into a chair with casual grace. "Though I understand the matter's been resolved." Inspector Briggs seemed quite confident about the Dawes boy's guilt. "You weren't in Halverton the night Grant died?" Battle's question emerged with the same casual tone he might have used to inquire about the weather. "No, indeed. Business in London required my attention. Left on the afternoon train, didn't return until the following evening. Rather fortunate timing, actually. Saved me from witnessing all the unpleasantness." Battle noted the slight emphasis on afternoon train and the careful precision of the alibi. "What manner of business, if you don't mind my asking?" "Political matters, primarily. I'm being considered for adoption as parliamentary candidate for the constituency. These things require considerable preparation and consultation." Vincent's pride was evident but controlled. "Father's quite keen on my entering public service." "The family has always believed in civic responsibility," Cyril Halverton added. "Vincent's education and natural abilities suit him admirably for political life. The Constituency Association shares our confidence." Battle absorbed this information with the same quiet attention he had given all other details. The Halvertons' cooperation seemed genuine, yet something in their manner suggested performances rather than spontaneous responses. Father and son presented a united front of respectable prosperity and civic virtue, but Battle detected undercurrents that merited further examination. The conversation continued for another quarter hour, covering practical matters of mill operations and local employment. Both Halvertons spoke knowledgeably about their business while maintaining the careful distance appropriate to their social position. Yet Battle observed that Vincent's comments about the workers carried a sharper edge than his father's paternalistic condescension, suggesting depths of character not immediately apparent. As the interview concluded, Battle found himself escorted to the front door by Vincent, who seemed eager to continue the conversation privately. However, their exchange remained brief and formal, limited to polite inquiries about Battle's impressions of Halverton and expressions of hope that the unfortunate matter would soon be concluded. Walking back toward the town centre, Battle reflected on the afternoon's observations. The Halvertons had presented themselves as model employers and citizens, cooperative with authority and properly concerned about their workers' welfare. Yet their very perfection of presentation suggested careful preparation, while their casual dismissal of Grant's complaints revealed attitudes that might inspire stronger reactions than they acknowledged. Chapter 4. The Workers. The factory whistle had blown for the midday break when Battle returned to the mill grounds. Workers emerged from the brick buildings in groups, carrying tin lunch pails and seeking patches of weak sunlight along the canal bank. The February air carried the smell of machine oil and coal smoke, mixed with the damp scent of the waterway that powered the mill's operations. Battle positioned himself near the main gate, observing the natural patterns of association among the workers. Men gathered in clusters that seemed to follow invisible social lines, older workers with long service standing apart from younger men, skilled craftsmen maintaining distance from general labourers, and a smaller group of darker-skinned workers who kept mostly to themselves near the loading dock. His approach remained deliberately casual, the manner of a visitor with time to spare rather than a detective conducting formal interviews. Experience had taught him that working people often spoke more freely when they felt unthreatened by official authority. A request for directions, a casual comment about the weather, or simple curiosity about factory operations could unlock conversations that formal questioning would prevent. "Busy place, this," he remarked to an older man who sat alone on a wooden crate, methodically eating bread and cheese from a worn cloth bundle. "Aye, that it is," the man replied without looking up. "Been busy near 40 years since I started here as a lad. Name's Albert Finch." "Albert," Battle nodded, settling beside him with the easy manner of someone seeking company. "I'm visiting from London, trying to understand how places like this operate. Must be hard work." "Hard enough, but honest. Better than the mines and steadier than farm work." Finch's weathered hands spoke of decades handling machinery and raw materials. "Course, things been unsettled lately. Bad business, losing young Grant the way we did." Battle's expression showed mild interest rather than sharp attention. "Someone mentioned that. Terrible thing to happen." "Terrible and wrong," Finch said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "Grant was a good lad, whatever troubles he had with management. Didn't deserve what happened to him." "What sort of troubles?" Finch chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Grant had ideas about fairness, about treating all workers the same, regardless of where they came from. Some folks didn't appreciate those ideas, if you take my meaning." A younger man approached their informal circle, introduced as Charlie Webb by Finch. Webb carried himself with the nervous energy of someone unused to speaking with strangers, but Finch's presence seemed to provide reassurance. "Charlie worked alongside Grant," Finch explained. "Knew him better than most." Webb nodded slowly. "Elijah was always thinking, always reading when he could, had books about workers' rights, about how things could be better. He used to say we deserve dignity same as anyone else." "Did that cause problems?" Battle asked. "Some thought it did," Webb replied carefully. "Elijah noticed things like how some workers got the dangerous jobs more often than others, or how complaints about safety got ignored when they came from certain people. He wasn't afraid to speak up about it." Battle learned that Grant had been particularly concerned about conditions in the dye works where chemical fumes created health hazards that seemed to affect the colonial workers disproportionately. Several men had developed breathing problems, but requests for better ventilation had been dismissed as unnecessary expense. "Grant went to see the managers about it more than once," Webb continued. "Last time was just a week before he died. Came back from that meeting looking angry and determined. Said he was going to take the matter higher up if nothing changed." As the conversation developed, other workers gradually joined the group. Battle's quiet manner and genuine interest encouraged them to share observations they might have kept private with more aggressive questioning. A picture emerged of Grant as a man respected by his colleagues, someone who combined natural leadership with genuine concern for others' welfare. The Dawes family came up naturally in conversation. Several workers spoke of young Thomas with sympathy, describing him as quiet and hard-working, devoted to his widowed mother and younger sister. The idea that he would attack Grant struck them as impossible. "Thomas looked up to Elijah," one man said firmly. "Used to listen when Elijah talked about workers standing together. Never saw them argue about anything serious." "What about the fight people mentioned?" Battle asked. "Wasn't a fight exactly," Webb explained. "More like a discussion that got heated. Thomas thought Elijah was pushing too hard, might lose his job stirring up trouble. Elijah said some things were worth the risk, but it ended with them shaking hands, agreeing to disagree." As the break period neared its end, Battle found himself speaking with 3 men from the colonial community. They proved more cautious than the other workers, but their respect for Grant's memory gradually overcame their natural wariness of official questions. "Mr. Grant treated us like men," one said simply. "Not many did that. When he spoke up for fair treatment, he meant it. Made some people angry, but he didn't care." "What people?" Battle asked. The man looked uncomfortable, but answered, "Management mostly. Some of the other workers too, the ones who thought we should be grateful for any work at all. Mr. Grant said dignity wasn't something you should have to earn." The factory whistles sounded again, calling the workers back to their duties. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to return to work, Battle thanked them for their time and insights. Their responses had painted a picture significantly different from the official version. Grant, as a principled man fighting for justice rather than a troublemaker, creating unnecessary conflict. Walking back toward the town centre, Battle reflected on the morning's conversations. The workers had spoken with the authentic grief of people who had lost someone they respected and trusted. Their account of Grant's character and motivation suggested depths of conflict that went beyond simple workplace disagreements. Most significantly, their unanimous rejection of Thomas Dawes as the killer indicated that the official solution satisfied legal requirements without reflecting social reality. Chapter 5. The Sister's Secret. The village school stood at the edge of Halverton's residential area, a modest brick building that served the children of mill workers and shopkeepers alike. Battle approached it in the late afternoon, when lessons had ended and the playground had emptied of young voices. The February dusk was already gathering, casting long shadows across the small garden where someone had planted winter vegetables with careful attention. Through the schoolroom window he could see a woman arranging papers at a wooden desk. Her movements were precise and economical, speaking of someone accustomed to order and routine. When she looked up at his gentle knock on the door, Battle noted the family resemblance immediately, the same intelligent eyes and strong jaw that had marked Elijah Grant on Fotografiet Inspecteur Briggs hadde vist him. Ruth Grant opened the door with the cautious politeness of someone who had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. She was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in the simple but well-maintained clothing of a woman who earned her own living through respectable work. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her hands showed the ink stains that marked her profession. "Miss Grant?" Battle removed his hat and spoke with the gentle courtesy he reserved for those who had reason to fear authority. "I'm Superintendent Battle from Scotland Yard. I wondered if I might speak with you about your brother." The colour drained from her face and her grip tightened on the door handle. For a moment, Battle thought she might refuse to see him, but something in his manner seemed to reassure her. She stepped aside to let him enter, though her movements remained stiff with anxiety. The schoolroom was warm and tidy, with children's drawings pinned to the walls and the faint smell of chalk dust in the air. Ruth Grant gestured toward a chair beside her desk, taking her own seat with the careful composure of someone fighting to maintain control. "I don't know what I can tell you that would be helpful," she began, her voice carefully steady. "The police have already arrested the person responsible." Battle studied her face with the patient attention that had served him well throughout his career. "Perhaps, but I find that family members often notice things that others miss. You knew your brother better than anyone." "Elijah was a good man," she said quickly, as if defending him against unspoken accusations. Whatever people might say about his ideas or his ways of speaking up, he was decent and kind. He worked hard and cared about people who couldn't care for themselves. What sort of ideas did he have? Ruth's hands moved restlessly among the papers on her desk. He believed that all people deserved fair treatment, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. That wasn't a popular belief in some circles, but Elijah never cared about being popular. Battle leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining gentle. "Miss Grant, I have reason to believe you wrote to me recently a letter about your brother's death." The admission hung in the air between them like a challenge. Ruth's composure cracked, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a handkerchief, dabbing at her eyes with shaking hands. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of what might happen if I spoke openly. But I couldn't let them blame Thomas Dawes for something he didn't do. That boy is innocent, and everyone who knows him understands that." "What did you see that night?" Ruth took a shuddering breath before answering. "I was walking home from my friend Mary's house, taking the path along the canal because it's shorter than the road. It was cold and clear, with enough moonlight to see clearly. As I approached the bridge, I saw someone moving near the mill buildings." "Someone you recognized?" "Not at first. The person was keeping to the shadows, moving carefully as if trying not to be seen. But when they passed under the lamp near the loading dock, I caught a glimpse of their face." She paused, gathering courage. It wasn't Thomas Dawes. Battle waited patiently for her to continue, understanding that pressing too hard might cause her to retreat into frightened silence. "The person I saw was well dressed, wearing a good coat and hat. They moved with purpose, not like someone drunk or angry, but like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. After a few minutes, they walked away toward the town center, still keeping to the shadows." "Did you see your brother that night?" Ruth shook her head. "Not alive. But the next morning, when they found his body, I knew something was wrong. Elijah was careful about avoiding trouble after dark, especially near the mill. He wouldn't have been there unless someone had asked him to come." Battle absorbed this information with his characteristic calm. "Why didn't you tell Inspector Briggs what you saw?" "Because I was frightened," Ruth admitted. Elijah had been receiving threats because of his activities, people telling him to keep quiet about working conditions and fair treatment. After he died, someone left a note in my garden saying that teachers who asked too many questions might find themselves without positions. The implications of her words settled over the room like gathering shadows. Battle understood the impossible situation she faced, knowing the truth but unable to speak it without risking her livelihood and safety. "The cloth you sent with your letter," he said quietly. "Where did you find it?" "Caught on a thorn bush near the canal bridge, close to where I saw the figure. It was fresh, not weathered, and the blood on it was still damp. I thought it might be important evidence, but I didn't dare take it to the local police." Battle reached into his coat pocket and withdrew his notebook, making careful entries in his precise handwriting. Ruth watched him work, her expression showing both relief and continuing fear. "Miss Grant, I want you to know that I take your information very seriously. What you've told me will be handled with appropriate discretion, but the truth must eventually come to light." She nodded, wiping away fresh tears. "Elijah always said that justice delayed was justice denied. I couldn't let his death be in vain, even if speaking up puts me at risk." As Battle prepared to leave, Ruth Grant walked him to the schoolroom door. The evening had grown properly dark and lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows throughout the village. The sight reminded Battle of how small communities could be both protective and dangerous, offering comfort to those who belonged, while threatening those who dared to challenge accepted truths. The walk back to his lodgings gave Battle time to consider the evening's revelations. Ruth Grant's testimony provided crucial details that contradicted the official version of events, but it also revealed the climate of fear that prevented honest witnesses from coming forward. Her courage in writing the anonymous letter had set the investigation in motion, but the full truth would require careful handling of forces more dangerous than simple criminal guilt. Chapter 6. Pressure and Fire. Morning brought news that changed everything. Battle was finishing his breakfast at the small inn where he had taken lodgings when Inspector Briggs arrived with a telegram that had been forwarded from Scotland Yard. The message was brief but significant. Vincent Halverton's claimed departure time to London did not match railway records, and a petrol station receipt found in his motor car showed a purchase made an hour after the supposed train had left. Briggs read the telegram with growing confusion, his certainty about the case beginning to crack like ice in spring sunshine. "I don't understand, Superintendent. Young Halverton said he took the afternoon train. Are you suggesting he lied about his whereabouts?" Battle folded the telegram carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. "I'm suggesting that alibis should be checked thoroughly before arrests are made. What other evidence supports the case against Thomas Dawes?" Well, there was the argument at the pub, and the fact that he couldn't prove where he went after leaving. Plus, he had reason to dislike Grant. They'd been having words about working conditions. "According to whom?" Briggs looked uncomfortable. "Several witnesses mentioned it, though now that I think about it, most of them seem to be repeating what others had said rather than speaking from direct knowledge." Battle spent the morning quietly pursuing the inconsistencies that had begun to surface. A visit to the railway station confirmed that no passenger matching Vincent Halverton's description had purchased a ticket on the afternoon in question. The station master, a careful man who took pride in knowing regular travellers, was certain that young Halverton had not passed through his station that day. More interesting was a conversation with the landlord of the Crown and Anchor, a smaller pub on the outskirts of town that catered to travellers rather than local workers. The man remembered serving a well-dressed young gentleman who had given his name as Mr. Vincent, but had seemed nervous and drank more than was wise. Most memorable was the bandage on the customer's right hand, which he claimed came from a riding accident. "Kept to himself, he did," the landlord recalled. "Sat in the corner booth and didn't want conversation. Left some time after 10 o'clock, walking unsteady but trying to appear sober. Can't say I was sorry to see him go. Had an unpleasant manner about him, if you ask me." The timing was significant. Elijah Grant's body had been discovered early the following morning, but the doctor's examination suggested death had occurred late the previous evening. If Vincent Halverton had been drinking at the Crown and Anchor until 10 o'clock, nursing an injured hand, his alibi became not just false, but deeply suspicious. Battle's methodical investigation was interrupted by urgent news from the village. Ruth Grant's cottage had caught fire during the night, and only the quick action of neighbours had prevented her death. She had escaped with minor burns and smoke inhalation, but her home and possessions were destroyed. The local fire brigade attributed the blaze to a faulty chimney, but several witnesses reported seeing someone near the cottage shortly before the flames were discovered. Battle found Ruth Grant at the home of her friend Mary, where she had been given shelter. The teacher's face was pale with shock and exhaustion, but her eyes showed the determined anger of someone who had been pushed too far. "It wasn't an accident," she said quietly when Battle arrived. "Someone wanted to silence me just as they silenced my brother. But I won't be frightened into staying quiet anymore." "Did you see who set the fire?" "No, but I heard footsteps on the gravel path about an hour before I smelled smoke. When I looked out, I saw a figure moving away from the house toward the main road. They were walking quickly, trying to avoid the streetlights." Mary, Ruth's friend and the village postmistress, added her own observations. "There's been talk in the village about Ruth asking too many questions. Some folks have been saying she should accept what happened to her brother and stop stirring up trouble. The morning after Elijah died, someone left a note in her garden warning her to keep quiet." Battle absorbed this information with growing certainty that the case involved forces more complex than a simple workplace dispute. The attempt to silence Ruth Grant through intimidation and arson revealed the desperation of someone with much to lose. It also provided him with leverage that might prove decisive. His next stop was Halverton House, where he requested another interview with both father and son. This time his manner was less casual and more direct. The comfortable study where they had first met now felt charged with tension as Battle laid out the inconsistencies in Vincent's alibi. Cyril Halverton's face grew pale as Battle methodically destroyed his son's story. The railway records, the petrol receipt, the witness at the Crown and Anchor, each piece of evidence built upon the others to create a picture that could not be explained away by simple mistakes or confusion. "There must be some error," Cyril insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Vincent was definitely in London on business. Perhaps he took a later train than he remembered. Vincent himself remained silent throughout most of the interview, his earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled anxiety. When Battle mentioned the bandaged hand witnessed at the pub, the young man's composure finally cracked. "That proves nothing," Vincent said sharply. "I injured my hand working on my motorcar. The bandage was merely a precaution." "On the same evening you claim to have been in London. I may have confused the dates. It's easy to mix up such minor details." Battle's patient questioning revealed more inconsistencies and contradictions. Vincent's story shifted with each challenge, while his father grew increasingly agitated. The atmosphere in the study became oppressive, filled with unspoken fears and crumbling lies. As the interview concluded, Battle made his position clear. The investigation would continue until the truth emerged, regardless of social position or local influence. The fire at Ruth Grant's cottage had demonstrated that someone was willing to use violence to protect their secrets, but such tactics would only strengthen his determination to see justice done. Walking back through the village as evening approached, Battle reflected on the day's developments. The careful facade of respectability that had protected the real killer was beginning to crumble under the weight of evidence and pressure. Soon the truth would emerge, bringing with it consequences that would reach far beyond a single family's reputation. Chapter 7. The Truth Emerges. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a constable whose nervous manner suggested urgent business. Cyril Halverton wished to see Superintendent Battle immediately at the mill office, the message said, regarding matters of great importance to the case. Battle dressed quickly, sensing that the careful pressure he had applied was finally bearing fruit. The mill office occupied a modest building separate from the main factory floor, its windows overlooking the canal where barges delivered raw materials and carried away finished goods. Cyril Halverton waited alone, his usual confidence replaced by the haggard appearance of a man who had spent the night wrestling with impossible choices. "Superintendent," Halverton began without preliminary courtesies, "I find myself in a position that requires complete honesty, regardless of personal cost." Battle took the offered chair and waited with characteristic patience. Experience had taught him that confessions emerged in their own time and manner, often triggered by pressures that had been building beneath the surface for days or weeks. "My son did not go to London the night Elijah Grant died," Halverton continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Vincent was here in Halverton, and I have been protecting him from the consequences of his actions." The admission hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Battle made no response, allowing the silence to encourage further revelation. "You must understand," Halverton said, his composure beginning to crack. "Vincent is my only son, my heir, the future of everything I've built. His political career, his marriage prospects, his entire life depended upon avoiding scandal. When I learned what had happened, I saw no choice but to create the alibi that would protect him." What exactly did happen that night? Halverton's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water on his desk. Vincent had been drinking at home, brooding about various matters that had been troubling him. Grant's complaints about working conditions, his accusations of unfair treatment, these things had angered Vincent more than I realized. Battle waited as Halverton gathered strength to continue his confession. Around 9 o'clock, Vincent left the house without telling me where he was going. He took his motor car and drove toward the mill, saying he intended to settle matters with Grant once and for all. I thought he meant to have words with the man, perhaps threaten his employment. I never imagined it would lead to violence. But you learn differently. Vincent returned home after midnight, his clothes torn and his hand badly cut. He was in a state of panic, babbling about an accident, about Grant falling and striking his head. At first, I thought he was simply drunk and confused, but gradually the truth emerged. Halverton's voice dropped to barely audible levels as he described the events his son had confessed. Vincent had found Grant near the mill's loading dock, apparently waiting for someone. The confrontation that followed had begun with words but quickly escalated when Grant refused to be intimidated. Vincent struck him with a piece of iron piping that was lying nearby, Halverton whispered. He claimed it was self-defense, that Grant had threatened him, but I could see in his eyes that anger had driven him beyond reason. Grant had insulted Vincent personally, questioned his right to judge working people, suggested that Vincent's political ambitions were built on his father's exploitation of labor. "What did you do when you learned this?" "I panicked," Halverton admitted. "My first thought was to protect Vincent, to find some way of avoiding the scandal that would destroy everything we had worked for. I drove to the mill myself, moved Grant's body to a more concealed location, and arranged the scene to suggest a different type of crime." Battle absorbed these details with professional calm, though inwardly he felt the satisfaction of seeing his careful investigation confirmed. The physical evidence had pointed toward this conclusion, but proving it had required patient pressure applied until the truth could no longer be suppressed. "The threats against Ruth Grant," Battle said quietly. "The fire at her cottage." Halverton's face crumpled with shame. Vincent was terrified that she had seen something that could connect him to the crime. I tried to reason with him, to convince him that intimidation would only make matters worse, but he was beyond listening to sense. The fire was his idea, his desperate attempt to silence her before she could speak to the authorities. And the campaign to blame Thomas Dawes? That emerged naturally from the circumstances. Dawes and Grant had been seen arguing, there was no clear alibi, and the local police were eager to solve the case quickly. It seemed like providence that suspicion fell on someone whose word would carry less weight than Vincent's. Battle stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mill buildings where hundreds of workers were beginning their daily labor. The irony was sharp. A man had died fighting for their dignity, while his killer had been protected by the very social system Grant had challenged. "Mr. Halverton," Battle said finally, "I must ask you to accompany me to the police station. Formal charges will need to be filed, and arrangements made for Vincent's arrest." Halverton nodded with the weary acceptance of someone who had exhausted all alternatives. "I understand, Superintendent. I only ask that you remember Vincent's youth and the pressures he faced. He is not naturally violent, simply someone who made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger." Battle made no comment on this plea for mercy. His job was to uncover truth and ensure justice, not to weigh the relative merits of social position against criminal responsibility. As they prepared to leave the mill office, Halverton made one final request. "The workers, Superintendent, they had no part in this deception. Whatever happens to Vincent and myself, I hope the mill can continue operating. Too many families depend on these jobs for the sins of ownership to destroy their livelihoods." The morning sun was climbing higher as they walked toward the police station, casting long shadows across the industrial landscape that had been the scene of so much conflict and tragedy. Battle reflected that justice, when it finally emerged, often revealed truths more complex and painful than simple guilt or innocence could contain. Epilogue. Justice served. 3 weeks had passed since Vincent Halverton's arrest, and Superintendent Battle sat in his familiar office at Scotland Yard, completing the final report that would close the Grant case officially. The February morning light filtered through windows that looked out onto London's busy streets, where life continued its normal patterns, undisturbed by the small drama that had unfolded in a Midlands mill town. The typewritten pages before him contained the measured language of official documentation, each fact recorded with the precision that police work demanded. Vincent Halverton had been charged with murder and would face trial in the coming months. His father, Cyril Halverton, faced charges of interfering with a police investigation and concealing evidence. The mill continued operating under temporary management while legal matters were resolved. Battle paused in his writing to consider the human elements that official reports could never fully capture. Thomas Dawes had been released from custody, though the weeks of imprisonment and public suspicion had taken their toll on both him and his family. The young man's mother had aged visibly during the ordeal, and his sister had withdrawn from school activities, bearing the shame that should never have fallen on innocent shoulders. A letter from Inspector Briggs provided updates on local developments. The mill workers had received the truth about Grant's death with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but their colleague remained dead, and the conditions he had fought to improve required continued vigilance to maintain. Ruth Grant had accepted a teaching position in a school 2 counties away, where her courage in speaking truth would not be held against her. The insurance settlement for her burned cottage had provided enough funds for a fresh start, though Battle knew that some wounds took longer to heal than others. Her final letter to him, written in the same careful hand that had first brought the case to his attention, expressed gratitude for his patience and determination to see justice done. The political consequences had rippled beyond Halverton itself. Vincent's parliamentary prospects had naturally ended, and the Constituency Association was reconsidering its attitudes toward candidates who inherited wealth rather than earning respect through service. Local newspapers had covered the story with attention to its broader implications about privilege and accountability. Battle's telephone rang, interrupting his reflections. The caller was Chief Inspector Morrison, inquiring about Battle's availability for a new case involving suspicious circumstances at a country estate in Devon. Battle accepted the assignment with his usual quiet efficiency, already beginning to organize his thoughts around fresh challenges. As he gathered the Grant case files for storage, Battle reflected on the lessons the investigation had provided. The anonymous letter that had initiated his involvement served as a reminder that justice often depended on the courage of ordinary people willing to speak difficult truths. Ruth Grant's decision to write that letter, despite her fear of consequences, had prevented an innocent man from paying for another's crime. The case had also demonstrated how social position could corrupt the pursuit of truth. The Halverton family's wealth and influence had initially protected them from serious scrutiny, while working-class suspects faced immediate assumption of guilt. Only persistent investigation had revealed the reality behind convenient assumptions. Most significantly, the case had shown how individual acts of violence grew from broader social conflicts. Elijah Grant had died because he challenged systems of inequality that others preferred to maintain undisturbed. His killer had struck not just in personal anger, but in defense of privileges that felt threatened by calls for justice. Battle closed the case file and placed it in the cabinet, where it would join hundreds of others, each representing lives disrupted by crime and restored, as far as possible, by the patient work of investigation and prosecution. His satisfaction came not from personal recognition, but from the knowledge that methodical police work had prevented injustice and revealed truth. The Morning Post arrived with its usual punctuality, carried by the same constable whose uneven boot heel Battle had noticed weeks earlier. Among the routine correspondence was a small package wrapped in brown paper, postmarked from Staffordshire. Inside, Battle found a simple wooden cross, hand-carved with careful attention to detail. The accompanying note, unsigned but written in familiar handwriting, contained only the words, "In memory of Elijah Grant, who believed all people mattered equally." Battle placed the cross on his desk beside his fountain pen and notebook. It would serve as quiet reminder of the case and the principles it had tested. Outside his window, London continued its daily business, while in a distant mill town, workers began another day of honest labour under conditions slightly improved by one man's courage and another's commitment to truth. The telephone rang again, signalling the beginning of new challenges and responsibilities. Battle answered with characteristic calm, ready to apply the same patient methods that had served justice in Halverton to whatever mysteries awaited his attention. In his experience, truth emerged through persistence rather than brilliance, and justice depended more on determination than genius. Thank you for listening to Murder Doesn't Matter. If you found Superintendent Battle's quiet pursuit of justice compelling, be sure to subscribe for more mysteries brought to you daily. Until next time, this is Alfie, signing off from Cafe Stories.